Berlin, April 30th, 1945, 3:30 in the afternoon. Two gunshots were heard in the corridor outside Hitler's private study in the Führer bunker, or one gunshot. The accounts disagree. The staff who rushed in found Adolf Hitler slumped on the sofa, Eva Braun beside him. The smell of bitter almonds, the specific, distinctive odor of cyanide, was present in the room. There was a gunshot wound to Hitler's right temple, or his left temple, or his mouth. The eyewitness accounts, collected in the days and weeks that followed by Allied intelligence officers who understood exactly how important this question was going to be, do not agree on this either. The bodies were carried to the Reich Chancellery garden above the bunker. Aviation fuel was poured over them. They were burned. The burning continued for several hours, interrupted by Soviet artillery bombardment that forced the participants to take cover repeatedly. What remained was buried in a shell crater in the garden. The Soviet army entered the bunker 2 days later. They searched the garden. They found partial remains. They conducted examinations, they filed reports, and then, for reasons that were entirely consistent with the political requirements of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, they classified everything, sealed the files, told the world that Hitler was dead, while simultaneously keeping the evidence that proved it locked in archives that would not be opened for decades. The result was the most consequential gap in the forensic record of the 20th century. And into that gap, into the specific, documentable, historically verifiable absence of conclusive public proof, every theory about Hitler's survival has been flowing ever since. This is not a video about conspiracy theories. It is a video about evidence, about what the historical and forensic record actually shows, about why the question of Hitler's death is more complicated than the standard narrative suggests, and why that complexity matters. Hitler died in the Führer bunker on April 30th, 1945. This is the conclusion of the overwhelming consensus of historians, forensic experts, and intelligence analysts who have examined the available evidence. It is almost certainly true. The weight of testimony, physical evidence, and documentary record points in one direction with a consistency that makes alternative explanations extremely difficult to sustain. Almost certainly. The qualifier matters. Because the Soviet Union, the power that physically controlled the evidence, that had custody of the remains, that conducted the initial forensic examinations, was run by a man who had his own reasons for keeping the question open. Stalin told Allied leaders at Potsdam in July 1945 that he believed Hitler had escaped, possibly to Spain, possibly to Argentina. Whether he believed this or was using the uncertainty as a political tool, the effect was the same. The definitive forensic closure that should have come in May 1945 did not come. What came instead was a chain of custody problem that has never been fully resolved. Remains that were examined, reburied, exhumed, re-examined, transferred, lost, found again, and finally subjected to DNA analysis in 2018, 73 years after the death they were supposed to document. The 2018 DNA analysis, conducted by French forensic scientists on teeth held in Russian archives, concluded that the teeth matched Eva Braun's known dental records and were consistent with Hitler's. Consistent with, not definitively identified as. The distinction is not pedantic. It is the entire question. What do we actually know? Not what has been asserted, not what has been assumed, not what the standard narrative requires to be true, but what the documentary and physical evidence actually establishes. We know that multiple eyewitnesses testified to Hitler's death in the bunker on April 30th, 1945. The testimony of Rokas Misch, Hitler's bodyguard, and the last surviving witness from the bunker was consistent across decades of interviews until his death in 2013. The accounts of secretaries, aides, and staff members who were present in the bunker in the final days form a coherent picture of Hitler's last hours: the farewell to staff, the marriage to Eva Braun, the distribution of cyanide capsules, the withdrawal to the private study. We know that Otto Gunsche, Hitler's personal adjutant, who was given explicit responsibility for ensuring that the bodies were burned, confirmed the cremation and described it in interrogations conducted by Soviet intelligence in the years of his captivity. Gunshat's account, combined with the accounts of others who participated in the cremation, provides a consistent description of what happened in the Reich Chancellery Garden on the afternoon of April 30th. We know that the Soviet SMERSH, the Red Army's counterintelligence organization, conducted an investigation in May 1945 that produced a report concluding Hitler had died by gunshot and cyanide poisoning. The SMERSH investigators exhumed partial remains from the garden, conducted autopsies, and compiled a forensic record that was immediately classified and would remain inaccessible to Western researchers for decades. We know that fragments of skull with a gunshot wound were recovered by Soviet investigators, along with teeth and jawbone fragments, and that these materials were compared with dental records provided by Hitler's dentist Hugo Blaschke, records that had been partially reconstructed from memory because the original X-rays were not available. The Soviet investigators concluded that the dental remains matched Hitler's known dental work. These are the things we know. The evidentiary basis for Hitler's death is real, substantial, and internally consistent. It is also incomplete. The problems with the official account are not invented by conspiracy theorists. They are documented in the historical record by mainstream historians who accept that Hitler died in the bunker, but acknowledge that the evidence has gaps. The first problem is the chain of custody. The remains recovered by Soviet investigators in May 1945 were not maintained with the forensic protocols that would be required for evidence of this importance. They were moved multiple times. They were stored in various locations. A skull fragment with a gunshot wound, identified by Soviet investigators as part of Hitler's skull, was held in Moscow archives and publicly displayed in 2000, only for DNA analysis conducted in 2018 to establish that it belonged to a woman under 40 years old, not Hitler. The skull fragment that the Soviet Union had been presenting as evidence of Hitler's death for decades was not Hitler's skull. This does not mean Hitler survived. It means that a piece of evidence that was presented as proof of his death was not what it was claimed to be. The distinction matters enormously for the integrity of the overall forensic case. The second problem is the dental evidence. The teeth and jawbone fragments held in Russian archives, the materials subjected to DNA analysis in 2018, have a provenance that has never been fully documented. The chain of custody from the Reich Chancellery Garden in May 1945 to the Russian archives where they currently reside involves multiple transfers, a period of apparent loss during which their location was unknown, and documentation that is incomplete. The 2018 DNA analysis was conducted on these materials by a team of French forensic scientists. Their conclusion that the teeth were consistent with Hitler's known dental work and that the mitochondrial DNA was consistent with samples from known Hitler relatives was published in a peer-reviewed forensic journal and represents the most rigorous scientific examination of the available physical evidence ever conducted. Consistent with, not definitively identified as. The distinction exists because DNA analysis of this kind, conducted on materials of uncertain provenance after 73 years, cannot achieve the certainty that a contemporary forensic examination under controlled conditions would have produced. The science is as good as the science can be. The materials and their history introduce uncertainties that the science cannot resolve. The third problem is Stalin. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, 10 weeks after Hitler's death, Stalin told American and British leaders that he believed Hitler had escaped. He suggested Hitler might be in Spain or Argentina. He said the Soviet Union had not found Hitler's body. Stalin was lying. The SMERSH investigation had concluded that Hitler was dead. Soviet investigators had the dental evidence. Stalin knew what his own intelligence service had found. Why did he lie? The most plausible explanation is political utility. A dead Hitler was a closed question. A missing Hitler, a Hitler who might have escaped, who might be organizing resistance, who might return, was a useful source of continued tension that served Soviet interests in the post-war period. Keeping the question open kept Western attention on the possibility of a Nazi revival rather than on Soviet expansion. But the fact that Stalin lied about what the Soviet Union knew creates a problem that has never been fully resolved. If the Soviet Union was willing to misrepresent its findings at Potsdam for political reasons, how confident can we be in the integrity of the forensic process that produced those findings? The same organization that classified the evidence and lied about its conclusions at the highest diplomatic level is the organization whose forensic work underlies the official account of Hitler's death. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a legitimate question about the reliability of a tainted evidentiary chain. The escape theories have circulated since 1945. They have taken many forms and pointed to many destinations: Spain, Argentina, Antarctica, various other locations sufficiently remote and sufficiently connected to wartime Nazi networks to be plausible as hideouts. None of them have produced evidence that withstands serious scrutiny. The Argentine theory, the most persistent and most elaborated of the escape narratives, rests on the documented fact that significant numbers of Nazi war criminals did escape to Argentina after the war, using networks known as rat lines that moved fugitives through Italy and Spain with the assistance of sympathetic clergy and corrupt officials. Adolf Eichmann escaped this way. Josef Mengele escaped this way. Klaus Barbie escaped this way. The infrastructure for escape existed. The networks were real. The question is whether Hitler used them. The FBI investigated this question seriously. Declassified FBI files from the post-war period contain multiple reports of alleged Hitler sightings in Argentina and other South American countries, submitted by informants of varying reliability. The files document the investigation. They do not document its conclusion, because the investigation did not produce evidence that Hitler had survived. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is also not evidence of presence. What the escape theories consistently fail to provide is a single piece of physical evidence: a document, a photograph, a DNA sample, a witness whose testimony can be independently verified that places Hitler alive after April 30th, 1945. The sightings are unverified. The alleged photographs are unverified. The supposed confessions of Nazi officials who claimed Hitler survived are contradicted by other Nazi officials who confirmed his death. The escape theories are not impossible. They are simply unsupported by evidence that meets any reasonable evidentiary standard. What did Allied intelligence actually conclude? The answer is less settled than the official narrative suggests. The British MI5 and MI6 conducted their own assessments in the immediate post-war period and concluded, on the basis of available evidence, that Hitler had most likely died in the bunker. Their assessments were qualified based on incomplete information, on testimony that could not be independently verified, on dental evidence that relied on reconstructed records rather than original X-rays. The CIA produced assessments in the 1950s and 1960s that similarly concluded Hitler was most likely dead while acknowledging the evidentiary limitations. The FBI files, released under the Freedom of Information Act, reveal something more interesting. The Bureau took the survival theories seriously enough to investigate them actively. It received and processed dozens of reports of Hitler sightings across South America. It investigated specific claims with specific detail. None of the investigations produced confirmation. In 1954, the CIA station in Caracas reported that a reliable source had provided information suggesting Hitler was living in Colombia. The report was investigated. Nothing was found. In 1955, a report from Buenos Aires described a German immigrant community in Patagonia and alleged that a man known locally as Adolf Schuttlemeyer was in fact Adolf Hitler. Investigated, nothing confirmed. The pattern across all of these investigations is consistent. Credible-seeming reports, serious investigation, no confirmation. The absence of any confirmed sighting across 80 years, across the entirety of the Western intelligence apparatus during the height of the Cold War, when finding a living Hitler would have been an intelligence triumph of immeasurable value, is significant. It is not conclusive. Intelligence agencies miss things. People hide successfully for long periods. But 80 years is a very long time to hide. The most recent and most rigorous examination of the physical evidence is the 2018 study published in the European Journal of Internal Medicine by a team led by Philippe Charlier of the University of Paris. The French team was granted access by Russian authorities to examine the dental remains held in Moscow archives. Their examination compared the teeth with dental records, the reconstructed records prepared from memory by Hugo Blaschka after the war, supplemented by other documentary evidence about Hitler's known dental work. Their conclusions were careful and specific. The teeth showed extensive dental work consistent with what was known about Hitler's dental history. The morphology of the teeth was consistent with Hitler's known dental characteristics. DNA extracted from the teeth showed mitochondrial sequences consistent with samples obtained from known Hitler maternal line relatives. The team was explicit about what their findings did and did not establish. They concluded that the evidence supported the identification of the teeth as Hitler's, but acknowledged the limitations imposed by the uncertain provenance of the materials and the absence of an original ante-mortem DNA sample for definitive comparison. This is the current state of the physical evidence. It is the best science that can be applied to the available materials. It is genuinely supportive of the conclusion that Hitler died in the bunker. It is also genuinely less than the definitive forensic closure that the question deserves. The gap between the scientific conclusion consistent with Hitler's dental work and DNA profile and the certainty that the question warrants, "This is Hitler, identified beyond reasonable doubt," is the gap that the Soviet Union created in May 1945 by classifying the evidence, misrepresenting its findings at Potsdam, and maintaining a forensic chain of custody that was compromised from the beginning. Hitler died in the Führer bunker on April 30th, 1945. The evidence for this conclusion is substantial. The eyewitness testimony is consistent and has survived decades of scrutiny without fundamental contradiction. The documentary record, German, Soviet, and Allied, supports it. The 2018 dental and DNA analysis, the most rigorous scientific examination of the physical evidence ever conducted, is consistent with it. The escape theories are not supported by any verified physical evidence. No confirmed sighting, no document, no photograph, no DNA, no witness whose testimony meets evidentiary standards. 80 years of investigation by intelligence agencies that had every reason to find a living Hitler have produced nothing. The case for Hitler's death is strong. The case for his survival is essentially non-existent in evidentiary terms. And yet, the Soviet Union lied about what it knew at Potsdam. The skull fragment it presented as Hitler's was not Hitler's. The chain of custody of the dental remains is compromised. The original forensic examination was conducted by an intelligence organization operating under political pressure from a leader who had his own reasons for managing the narrative. These are not invented problems. They are real gaps in the evidentiary record that exist because the Soviet Union made them exist, deliberately, for political reasons, in the immediate aftermath of the war, when the evidence could have been secured and documented in a way that would have closed the question permanently. The question is not closed permanently. It is closed well enough, well enough that the consensus of historians and forensic scientists accepts Hitler's death as established fact, but not closed with the completeness that the evidence would have permitted if it had been properly handled in May 1945. This matters because the gap is not accidental, it was created. And the person who created it, who classified the evidence, who lied at Potsdam, who maintained deliberate uncertainty about a question his own investigators had answered, was Joseph Stalin. Hitler's death is the conclusion the evidence supports. The Soviet Union's handling of that evidence is the reason the conclusion cannot be stated with the absolute certainty it deserves. The case is closed, the file is not clean. And the specific untidiness of that file, the compromised chain of custody, the misidentified skull, the qualified DNA analysis, the Potsdam lie, is the Soviet Union's final contribution to the Hitler question. A contribution that ensured the question would outlast the evidence, that uncertainty would be more durable than proof. Stalin, who feared a dead Hitler less than he feared a closed question, got what he wanted. The question is still open, just barely, for reasons that have nothing to do with Hitler and everything to do with the man who told the world he might have escaped. The bunker is under a parking lot in Berlin. The dental remains are in an archive in Moscow. The skull fragment that was not Hitler's has been quietly set aside. And the question, did Hitler really die in the bunker, is answered by the evidence with a confidence that stops just short of certainty. Just short. Because Stalin needed it to. If this story stayed with you, if the forensic gaps and the Soviet lies and the question that was deliberately kept open mean something to you, there are more of them waiting. Every cover-up, every gap in the record, every moment when the truth was almost certain and someone made sure it stayed almost. Subscribe to Dash History and stay.